basis. So we're going to do that tonight. It's good to have some guests with us. It's good to see Elise Hester with us tonight. I'm glad that she's able to be out with us, and others of you who have been sick, and we're glad that you've been able to come and be with us. I want to look at Luke 15 and read as we begin tonight from verses 1 and 2. Then all the tax collectors and the sinners drew near to him to hear him. And the Pharisees and scribes complained, saying, "This man receives sinners and eats with them." These two verses set up the remaining 30 verses in which these three parables are found. And these parables, as you know, deal with something that was lost and is now found, and the importance of why it is to find those things which are lost. And of course, Jesus is going to talk about spiritual things. There are, I think, at least 6 groups that are identified here. Some are specifically stated, some are alluded to, but there are at least 6. There are the tax collectors and the sinners, who really comprise a group, but because I said 7, I got to come up with 7. So we've got the tax collectors and the sinners, and then we have the Pharisees and the scribes. And then we have Jesus, of course, and we have, I think, although not specifically mentioned in these first 2 verses, I think because of what's said later, the disciples, which would make 6, and then probably there are others who don't fall into any of that category who are listening to Jesus. And they're going to hear these parables that Jesus is now going to tell. So, seems to me that there are probably 7 different, as Jesus and others would identify a group, 7 different groups to come and hear these parables. And verse 3 tells us that these parables are spoken to them. The pronoun is them. And probably he refers to the Pharisees and the scribes. That is the last group that's mentioned prior to him saying them. So the antecedent, it seems to me, would be the Pharisees and the scribes. But like in many things Jesus said when he was talking to a group of people, he may have been talking specifically to one group, but others were hearing him. And that's what appears to me to be happening in this particular time, at this time and among these parables. Chapter 16 tells us, I think, that in verse 1 tells us that very probably the whole group, whoever the group was, were hearing what he had to say. And there is little doubt that the main thrust of these parables, which are all about these things which are lost and found, the main thrust of the parables, if you combine the bookends, that's what he says in verses 1 and 2, what Luke records about the people who are there. And then what he says in the last 8 verses of the chapter when he talks about, beginning in verse 25, this older brother. It seems to me that it's the older brother who really has the focus of the attention, although he tells the 3 parables about what is lost and found. And I don't know if he tells 3 parables because they didn't get it the first time he perceived, well, you didn't understand the first one, so I'm going to tell you another one that has pretty close to the same idea. It's a different story, but the same idea. And then maybe after the second one, I don't know if he was thinking because he knew their hearts. I don't know if he thought, I need to tell them something else and try to get their attention. Or he told 3 parables because he knew the last one was going to be the parable of the prodigal son. And what he really wanted to get to was what he said at the end of that, because that's what would really catch their attention. At least that's what he hoped would catch their attention. And so this was an important, I think, parable or parables for them to understand. So let's look at Luke 15. And while some of you could probably, maybe you can't, maybe you could quote it. But for the sake of us putting all this in its context, I want to read the parable of what we call the prodigal son. And let's just catch the flow. And there may be some things about this as we read that maybe you haven't seen before, or maybe you had forgotten, or maybe that can be called to your attention at this time. That's typically what happens anytime I read anything. I'll read it, and then there will be something that will catch my eye every time I read that maybe I've not seen before, or maybe I've forgotten. So such may be the case with you tonight. So In this third parable, Jesus said to these groups of people, a certain man had 2 sons, and the younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the portion of goods that falls to me. So he divided to them his livelihood. And not many days after, the younger son gathered all together, journeyed to a far country, and there wasted his possessions with prodigal living. But when he had spent all, there arose a severe famine in that land, and he began to be in want. And then he went and joined himself to a citizen of that country, and he sent him into his fields to feed swine. And he would gladly have filled his stomach with the pods that the swine ate, and no one gave him anything. But when he came to himself, he said, How many of my father's hired servants have bread enough and to spare, and I perish with hunger? I will arise and go to my father, and will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you, and I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants. And he arose and came to his father. But when he was still a great way off, his father saw him and had compassion and ran and fell on his neck and kissed him. And the son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and in your sight, and am no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to his servants, Bring out the best robe and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand and sandals on his feet, and bring the fatted calf here and kill it, and let us eat and be merry. For this my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. And they began to be merry. Now his older son was in the field, and as he came and drew near to the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked what these things meant. And he said to him, Your brother has come, and because he has received him safe and sound, your father has killed the fatted calf. But he was angry and would not go in. Therefore his father came out and pleaded with him. So he answered and said to his father, Lo, these many years I have been serving you. I never transgressed your commandment at any time. And yet you never gave me a young goat that I might make merry with my friends. But as soon as this son of yours came, who has devoured your livelihood with harlots, you killed the fatted calf for him. And he said to him, Son, you are always with me, and all that I have is yours. It was right that we should make merry and be glad, for your brother was dead and is alive again, and was lost and is found. The older brother does not play much of a role in the early part of this story. As a matter of fact, he just gets evidently what was rightfully his, which was 2/3 of the father's inheritance. The livelihood which his father had gained, Deuteronomy 21 would indicate that among the Jewish people, the older son would get 2/3 if there were 2 in it, and the younger son would get 1/3. And so that's what happened. And so he was given that. We aren't told how he reacted to his brother's departure, but that's not the point of the story again. But I don't know if he had had contact with his younger brother. I don't know if the younger brother had gone to him early and said, Listen, I'm going to go to Dad, and I'm going to ask for what's rightfully mine, and then I'm going to go. And it may very well have been that what the younger brother did, and I don't know this is pure speculation, I don't know, but the younger brother may have gone to him and said, Listen, I'm going to get what's rightfully mine, and then I'm going to go take it, and I'm going to do whatever it is that I want to do. They may have talked about what he was going to do. It does become apparent in the latter part of the story, at least how Jesus tells the story. The point that he wants to make is the older brother did know how he spent his money, because he told the father he went out and wasted it on wasteful living. He went out and wasted it on harlots, on prostitutes. And so somehow he had gotten that message. I don't know if his brother had told him before he left, that's what I'm going to go do with the money. I doubt that that's what happened, although that may have been in his heart and in his mind to do that. That doesn't sound unlikely for a young boy who's lost his mind anyway to go out and do that kind of thing. That's what he did. I don't know if the older or the younger son, the younger brother, when he got out there away from home, if he sent word back to his older brother, which I doubt that he did. I doubt that he sent him a letter. I don't know that they had mail back then, that kind. The Pony Express wasn't invented yet. So I don't know if he'd gotten any information or not. But older brother knew something had happened. He had some idea about how this young man had spent, how his brother had spent the money. But what we do know is that he wasn't happy about the party, and that's for sure. And this older brother was, if you think about it, the older brother was respectable, he was responsible, and he was dutiful. He had continued to do what his father had asked him to do. He was an industrious young man. He was working, and he was doing from an observation standpoint what his father wanted him to do. So in that sense, he was a good son. But the motive behind what he did apparently was this: Dad, I'm doing it and he's not. I'm doing what you've told me to do and he's not doing it. Matter of fact, he's gone just the opposite direction. And so if you look at him and you look at me, I'm a lot better than him. I think that's the motive behind what he said. And certainly it was the motive behind how he acted. And so the contrast with the younger brother was that which made him good. That's the thing that made him right. That's what made him, and I think we can say it this way, that's what made him better than his younger brother. And so that's the point Jesus wants to make. And my guess is that as they heard Jesus tell this story, as he's, I think everything's good until Jesus gets to the part where he starts talking about the older brother. And I can see them kind of turning and kind of looking down and kind of looking away and all this kind of thing. And the more he tells, the more they're looking away. And the more they become disgusted with what Jesus is saying. Because they know. They know what he's talking about. That was the whole point of the parable, is that they would get that story and understand who it was. So, as we think about the story, and I'm going to suggest this does not. We get the younger brother. There's a lot of lessons. I love talking and preaching about the younger brother. There's a lot of lessons. There's a whole series of lessons in there about the prodigal son. And again, what prodigal means is wasteful. It doesn't mean, as I think sometimes we think, that it means lost. He was lost, but he was lost because he was wasteful. And that's what prodigal means. And what you see in this story, I think, are both boys are prodigal sons. They're just prodigal sons in different ways. And while the prodigal, if I can use the term, the prodigalness of the first boy is not something that probably most of us would identify with, because I don't know any of us that have gone to our father and said, hey, give me what's rightfully mine. I can tell you what would have happened if I was a young boy and I'd gone to my father and said, give me what's rightfully mine. I don't even have to tell you what would happen. You know what would have happened. Nothing would have happened in terms of what I wanted other than sit down, I got to talk to you. But in this instance, that was something that they could do. So that's what he did. And he went out, as the text tells us, and he wasted it on this kind of living. And we get all the stories about that. I think we get plenty of the applications about that, and we should. And I think there is an application to that. I don't think Jesus just told that story to get to the older brother. I think there was an issue there that he wanted them and us to understand. But I just want to make just a couple of comments tonight in reference to an application for us as it relates to the older brother. Because kind of like I said this morning, sometimes we see these stories, whether they're parables or whether they're stories that were real, we get so caught up in pointing fingers that this is what he did, and this is what they did, and this is what she did, and they shouldn't have done that, and they were sinners. Sometimes we get caught up in that, and we really lose sight of the application for us. And so I would suggest, as we think about this, if the shoe fits, wear it. If this is something that is affected by you, then certainly, or by me, then we need to think about that. And the primary thing that I think we need to understand about this parable, I wish I had time to just go around the room and say, okay, what do you think that the primary issue is here? But I think all of us would come up, I think, with the same answer. And that's this: nobody's better than anybody else. No one group is better. No one person is better than somebody else. Not in reference to how God sees it. And that is the issue. And God wants us to see what he sees and recognize that. But what we see here is that to see ourselves as better than someone else because maybe we're not doing that, or we're not doing this, or we're not doing that, and we see ourselves as somebody who's not living an ungodly life, to to say that and to have the reaction and the feeling and the sense about that in reference to somebody else is unrighteous. And it's self-righteous. And that attitude, I think Jesus is wanting these Pharisees and scribes to understand. That's reprehensible. If you have an attitude when you look at someone else and go, you know, I'm glad I'm not like that person. It's the publican idea. And the sinner. And the sinner's beating his breast and the publican saying, you know, I'm glad I'm not like that. And Jesus is saying, you know, you can't have that attitude. That's an arrogant, self-righteous, and selfish, ambitious attitude. And if you have that kind of attitude, it's easily exposed. And what Jesus, I think, does by telling this story is he promotes a very ugly scene. Again, we weren't there. We don't know. We can't, you know, a lot of times it's interesting. When you're talking to a group of people, you kind of watch their body language. I don't know. You're all, at least most of you, are looking at me, which is not much to look at. But I'm looking at you, and I'm telling this story, and sometimes I see you smile. You kind of, you got that smile sometimes. You kind of put your head down, and I'm thinking, I wonder if that hit home to them. I wonder if I'd said something, and boy, they're thinking, yeah, well, it tickles me when I preach. And this happens a lot of times. You know, people will walk out or people will see you or they're seeing your text and say, you were talking right to me. And while I wasn't talking right to them, that is the point. You want people to feel the reaction. You want people to say, you know, he was talking to me. And as I've told you many times, most of the time I'm talking to myself when I'm preaching. And I don't know how these people responded to that. I don't know as Jesus was talking to the different groups, because what he's saying about the older brother would not have applied to everybody. It would not have applied to the tax collectors and the sinners. It wouldn't have applied to them. They already had gotten their message. But this was not their message. This was the Pharisees and the scribes' message. And I'll guarantee you, you read the whole page, you read all the synoptic writers, and even in John's gospel, and when he's talking to them, they're not responding favorably. But yet, he preached to them. But this was an ugly scene. And the lesson was for the Pharisees. And what the lesson is that mercy and grace is extended to all. It's not just extended to all, but everybody needs that. So there's no place for any of us at any time in our lives to say, you know, I'm better than somebody else. God is more pleased with me than he is somebody else. Or God looks at me differently than he looks at somebody else. And I'm not suggesting that there aren't differences. But in reference to what God, the Father, okay, in reference to what the Father can do for both the sinners and the tax collectors and the Pharisees and the scribes, it's all the same. It's all the same. Because everybody needs mercy and everybody needs grace. And both these boys were prodigals. They wasted their inheritance. One wasted his inheritance, and the other wasted an unfounded feeling of superiority. Now, I'm not talking about this tonight because I feel some sense of that we need to hear this necessarily. But there are a lot of things that I talk about in a sermon that I'm not talking about because I think somebody needs it. But I don't think it's in here because Jesus said it's a good story. I think he's talking to them about it, and he's giving it to us because there may be tendencies sometime for us to have that kind of attitude. And he doesn't want us to have that. As a matter of fact, that's, as I said, that's reprehensible to him. The whole parable goes back, I think, really to the things that we talked about this morning. And that's part of why I wanted to talk about this other prodigal son tonight, is because it kind of made me think about some of those things that we talked about this morning. But sometimes we're so conscious of what others are not doing that it's hard for us to focus upon ourselves and to stay focused on what it is that we need to be doing. And that is a form of what this older brother did. And that's the kind of thing that I think we need to make sure we avoid. The Pharisees had a tough time seeing their own spiritual poverty. That's seen over and over and over again. And I would say this about that. That best not happen to us. We can't go about our lives and live our lives so concerned about what others are doing or not doing that we don't focus upon what we ought to be doing. And I think that's part of the point, if not the main point, of this parable specifically. And again, Jesus is kind of following those other two parables with this parable to make the point that I think he makes in the last part of this parable, so that they'll get it. Now, unfortunately, they didn't get it quite as quickly as I think he wanted them to, but that's not uncommon. The reason I know that is because in Matthew 21, I want you to turn your Bibles there. This is the passage that Blake read tonight as we began our service. This is from Matthew 21, beginning in verse 28, and Jesus would say this. This was on Tuesday before he was crucified on Friday. So he was making this last-ditch effort, as he typically did. And again, he's making a statement about it's a parable about two boys. It's not the same parable, but it's a parable. He wants them to see. You know, when you're talking about two boys, and Jesus said, which one did it? And he's talking to the Pharisees and scribes. I guarantee you, they got it. They may not have accepted it, but they didn't raise their hand and say, hey, who are you talking about, Lord? No, they got it. And their reaction in this parable shows that they weren't too interested in talking to him about it. They never accepted what he said. They didn't want to accept that. But Jesus, just about till his dying breath, wanted to make sure they understood the message. So in verse 28 of Matthew 21, Jesus would say this, what do you think? A man had two sons, and he came to the first and said, son, you go work today in my vineyard. And he answered and said, I will not. But afterward he regretted it, and he went. And then he came to the second and said likewise, and he answered and said, I go, sir, but did not go. Which of the two did the will of his father? They said to him, the first. And Jesus said to them, assuredly I say to you that tax collectors and harlots enter the kingdom of God before you. For John came to you in the way of righteousness, and you did not believe him, but tax collectors and harlots believed him. And when you saw it, you did not afterward relent and believe him. This is about getting it, this is about getting obedience. This is about getting what the Lord said. At some point you get it. That's what this parable's about. And it's very simple. And they knew it was a simple answer because do you notice their answer? You notice how short it is? There wasn't a discussion. There wasn't, Lord, we want to talk to you about that. Here's the answer, the first. That's the answer. They knew. Jesus is about that. He's been talking about this now for months, even years. He's been talking about this. And Jesus tells a different parable with the same consequence, and they say the first. And I think that's important. The first son, these tax collectors and harlots, they came around. Jesus says, he says to these temple officials, you know, the tax collectors and the harlots, they finally came around to John's way of teaching. John, he's talking about what John had been teaching. They finally came around to it. They didn't accept it at first, but they finally relented, and they did what they should do. And basically he says about the second son, you know, you didn't do that. That they were long on profession and they were short on performance. And he reminds them of that very thing. When Jesus asked, who did the Father's will? They responded with the first. And may I just suggest this to all of us, folks? There's no such thing as a worse sinner. There's no such thing as, you know, well, I'm this and they're that. There's no such thing as that. There are things that we do differently that identify and characterize ourselves as sinners. That's true. But we are never in a position at a point in our lives where we somehow look down upon somebody because of the contrast that we make with them. I look at some people, that's for sure, and when I look at them, I sometimes ask myself, I wonder why they are involved in that kind of activity. I wonder why they do those things that they do. And a lot of times the reason is because, well, that's probably enjoyable to them. I don't know why they would be doing it if it weren't that. And then when I do that, I very quickly look inwardly and say to myself, I wonder why that the Lord isn't looking at me going, I wonder why Kenny does what he does. He's one who professes to be a disciple of mine. He's one who professes faith. I wonder why he does what he does. And then I'm reminded that all of us, whether we're harlots, tax collectors, Pharisees, scribes, or New Testament Christians, I realize that all of us need the mercy and grace of God. And I think that's what this parable, at least in terms of a modern day application, is for us, is that we need to make sure that our heart's what it ought to be. And that we understand every time, every day, how grateful we ought to be to God that He has been willing to forgive us. And that puts us in that right relationship with Him. I don't know if these, I don't know how many scribes and Pharisees got it. I don't know if after the death of Christ, I don't know if after His resurrection, I don't know how many of those temple officials, I don't know if the chief priests or the scribes, I don't know how many of them would ultimately come to Christ. I do know this, that like Mitch reminded us this morning in Acts 5, and I love the passage that he used in Acts 5, those last 4 verses. You know, after the resurrection, those disciples were changed. Now, I don't know that those temple officials were changed, but the disciples were changed. And those temple officials continued to flog them and beat them, but the disciples were changed. And I would assume that there were some. We see some of the Roman officials who obeyed the gospel. And I'm grateful for that. I'm grateful that everybody sees the need. But God help me if I ever think that in some way and in some manner, I'm better than somebody else because I don't do what other people do. May God help me to get that out of my head and to be thankful to Him for what He has done for me and what He can do for others as well. May God help us appreciate that lesson each and every day. That's my lesson to you tonight. Thank you for listening so kindly as you always do. If you have a spiritual need that we can help you with, we invite you to come. While together we stand and while we sing.
Have you been to Jesus for the cleansing